Imagine this scenario for a moment. You're packing up like your entire life. You've lived in this relatively quiet, comfortable city, Leeuwarden, in the Netherlands.
Right, a place where you know the streets, the people, you know the exact rhythm of the place.
Exactly. But you've made this massive leap. You are moving to London, 7 million people, the epicenter of, well, basically everything.
Quite the upgrade in chaos.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And you spent months doing the research. You've warned all your friends, and you found what everyone tells you is the absolute holy grail. A
Yes.
small, affordable, one-bedroom apartment in southwest London.
Which is, frankly, a logistical triumph. I mean, anyone who's even glanced at the London real estate market knows that finding an affordable one-bedroom is basically like finding a unicorn. It just doesn't happen.
It's a total miracle.
Mm.
So you orchestrate this enormous international move. You cancel your temporary lease back in the Netherlands. Your parents and your brother actually drive all the way over from Holland in an SUV packed to the absolute brim with every single one of your earthly possessions.
Oh, wow. So the stakes are incredibly high at this point.
Yeah, the plan is flawless. You've built in like a 10-minute buffer between dropping off the old keys and picking up the new ones. You can already picture it, right? You hand over the keys, you unpack a few boxes, order some absurdly expensive London takeout, and just watch Netflix in your brand new life.
But life rarely respects a flawless itinerary.
It really doesn't,
Yeah.
because it's the day before the move.
Yeah.
You're sitting there anticipating the finish line, and your phone buzzes. It's the new landlady, and she has changed her mind.
Just like that.
Just like that. Last minute, she's pulling out. She's not renting you the apartment. So suddenly, there you are. You have absolutely no place to live.
Oh, man, that is brutal.
Right. You had SUV full of your entire life sitting on the street. You've
Right.
dragged your family across international borders to help you. And you're just sitting in your parents' hotel room,
Yeah.
completely and utterly panicking. Big time.
It's the classic mental spiral. I mean, the brain receives this massive shock to its expectations, and it simply hits the emergency eject button. The rational faculties shut down entirely, and panic just takes the wheel.
And the author of the book we're exploring today, Darius Foroux, was the guy in that hotel room. He admits he was just pacing around, blaming himself,
Yeah.
literally saying out loud, I don't know what to do. I'm sitting here like an idiot.
Which is such a natural reaction, but it doesn't solve the problem, does it?
Not at all. But before I tell you how he gets out of this and what it means for us,
Mm-hmm.
I want to take a quick second to talk directly to you, the listener.
Yeah, let's pause the story for just a moment.
Right. So this deep dive is actually brought to you by the incredible channel Book Visionary. And if you want to support our deep dives and help us keep unpacking these amazing sources for you, I need you to do a few quick things right now.
It really makes a huge difference.
It does. Please subscribe to the Book Visionary channel, like this video, share it with anyone who loves a good deep dive, drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts, and make sure you turn on that bell icon so you're always notified when new content drops.
Supporting Book Visionary is what makes all of this possible.
Absolutely. So returning to that hotel room in London, he spent the entire day and the whole evening just mentally beating himself up. It felt like the absolute end of the world.
A classic first world problem that feels apocalyptic in the moment.
Exactly. But then, the next morning, he wakes up, and with a little encouragement from his family, this switch just flips. He realizes something incredibly profound in its simplicity, which is that feeling sorry for himself is doing absolutely nothing.
The panic is functionally useless.
Right. He literally says to himself, think straight. He decides to intentionally replace that chaotic mess in his head with clarity. He books an Airbnb just to buy some time. And the punchline to this whole nightmare, a week later, that exact same landlady changes her mind again and lets him move in.
Oh, you have got to be kidding me. All of that agonizing, all of the pacing, the spiraling, the profound mental suffering, it was entirely 100% for nothing.
Totally for nothing. Which perfectly frames the mission of today's deep dive. We are unpacking Darius Foroux's book, Think Straight. The goal here is to figure out how to take the chaotic, noisy mess of our default minds and forge it into a single, sharp, useful tool.
And the underlying premise we have to grapple with first is just the sheer power of the human brain. I mean, it is without a doubt the most awe-inspiring, complex, miraculous information processing tool in the known universe.
Right, like our most advanced supercomputers don't even come close to replicating its raw power.
Not even close. And yet, every single one of us is born without a manual for it. We don't know how to use it properly, so we allow this magnificent tool to become our primary source of immense suffering. This deep dive is essentially about providing that missing manual.
And to find the foundation of that manual, we actually have to go way back, all the way back to 1869, to look at the life of William James.
William James is such a fascinating figure to start with. Most people who study psychology, they know him as the leading psychologist in America during his time. He's one of the founding fathers of the philosophical school of pragmatism.
But in 1869, he wasn't any of those things, right?
No, not at all. He was just a 27-year-old guy who had recently graduated from Harvard Medical School, and he was enduring this profound existential crisis of meaning.
And calling it a crisis of meaning almost underplays it, honestly. The sources detail that he was suffering from severe clinical depression, he was having crippling panic attacks, vivid hallucinations.
Yeah, it was incredibly severe.
He spent months actively contemplating suicide. His biographer actually noted that James spent a huge portion of his early life just rationalizing his decision not to kill himself on any given day.
And the darkest part of his despair was actually rooted in his own medical training, because his father had suffered from the exact same agonizing mental conditions years earlier.
Oh, so he thought it was hereditary.
Exactly. Looking at this through the lens of a 19th century graduate, James concluded his condition was purely biological. He believed he inherited a broken brain, that he was genetically doomed to suffer, and therefore it was entirely out of his control.
He felt trapped by biological determinism. That has to be one of the most terrifying places a human being can find themselves. To genuinely believe you're suffering is just hardwired into your DNA and there's no escape.
It's a very dark place. But a year later, in 1870, he reads an essay by a French philosopher named Charles Renouvier. And James has this psychological breakthrough that literally changes the course of modern psychology.
He writes a single sentence in his journal, right?
Yes. He writes, "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will."
Wow. The implications of that are just massive.
They really are. What Renouvier helped James see is that free will isn't necessarily about controlling your external environment. It's not even about controlling the raw initial thoughts that bubble up in your brain. True free will is about the conscious sustaining of a thought.
And the author draws a really sharp line here that I think we need to clarify. He argues that we cannot control our consciousness.
No, you can't. If you sit in a perfectly quiet room for 2 minutes, your brain will inevitably just start throwing random data at you.
Right, like, did I leave the oven on? Or what did my boss mean by that weird email? Or I wonder what happened to my friend from 3rd grade. It's just this relentless river of random thoughts.
You cannot stop that river. The brain is an association machine, so it will constantly generate material. But, and this is the real fulcrum of James's breakthrough, you absolutely can control your focus.
Meaning you can choose which thoughts to engage with.
Exactly. You have the ability to observe that river and actively choose which of those passing thoughts you're going to pluck out of the water and sustain. You choose which thoughts you feed with your cognitive energy.
And that realization is the absolute bedrock of pragmatism. It's this profound shift from saying, I can't help but feel this way because my brain's broken, to saying, I feel this way because I'm actively deciding to focus on this feeling.
Right. But I know what you're probably thinking.
Yeah. I have to admit, it sounds almost dangerously simple. Can someone who is deep in the trenches of severe anxiety or clinical depression really just decide not to be depressed anymore by plucking a happier thought out of the river?
It's a vital distinction to make, and the author is very careful to include an explicit disclaimer in the text about this. This framework is not medical advice for clinical conditions like major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, or severe panic disorders.
If someone is dealing with chemical or structural realities in the brain, they obviously need a physician.
Absolutely. We are discussing a philosophical framework for everyday cognitive function. I mean, even William James, after writing that triumphant sentence in his journal, he didn't just wake up the next morning cured.
Right. The sources note it took him 3 full years to actually pull himself out of that depression.
3 grueling years of relentless effort. Because the framework requires viewing the mind not as some, magical entity, but as a muscle. And just like any physical muscle, if you want it to perform under stress, it requires rigorous, daily, deliberate training.
We understand this perfectly with our bodies. Nobody goes to the gym consistently for 4 years in college, declares themselves permanently fit, and then just sits on the couch eating junk food for 40 years, expecting to run a marathon.
It would be absurd. Yet that is precisely how the vast majority of society treats cognitive health.
Hmm.
We finish our formal education, we establish our basic mental models of how the world works, and then we just stop training. We coast on autopilot.
We seek out passive entertainment that requires zero mental strain. We avoid challenging our own assumptions.
And then we're completely shocked when our minds feel weak, chaotic, or overwhelmed the moment life throws a genuine crisis our way. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus was actually adamant about this. The life of wisdom requires proper, structured training. It's never just a haphazard enterprise.
So if we accept this foundational premise, that we possess the free will to choose our focus, and that our mind is a muscle demanding constant training, we have to look at the opponent we are actually training to fight. Like, why is it so incredibly hard to focus?
Why does our default state feel like a constant uphill battle against our own brains?
Exactly. And the author uses a brilliant visual metaphor to capture this default state. He asks you to imagine a drawing. On the left side of the page, there is this dense, chaotic, tangled scribble of black lines.
Like a ball of yarn that a cat has just completely destroyed.
Yeah, perfect description. And that messy scribble represents the untrained mind. It's the physical manifestation of worry, stress, confusion, playing out 50 different worst-case scenarios simultaneously. It is pure noise.
And then, on the right side of the drawing, emerging out of that chaotic scribble, is a single, clean, straight arrow pointing directly to a circle.
Which represents clarity, right?
Yeah, exactly. It represents a thought that has been deliberately selected and given a single useful purpose. The entire journey of thinking straight is the journey of untangling the scribble and forging it into the arrow.
But to untangle it, we have to understand what causes the scribble in the first place. The sources point heavily to the sheer volume of data we are subjected to.
It's unprecedented. The modern human brain is constantly bombarded with orders of magnitude more information than it evolved to process.
News, social media, work emails, texts, environmental stimuli, it's every waking second. To survive this onslaught without short-circuiting, our brains have developed biological workarounds. They rely on mental shortcuts called heuristics.
And heuristics are a fascinating evolutionary adaptation. They're basically rough rules of thumb or strategies derived from past experiences. The brain uses them to drastically reduce the cognitive load of making decisions in the present moment.
The classic example being trial and error, right?
Right, trial and error is a deeply ingrained heuristic. You touch a hot stove, it burns, you develop a shortcut. Don't touch glowing red things.
Makes sense for survival.
It does, but think about how disastrously impractical that heuristic is for complex modern life decisions. If you rely purely on trial and error to figure out how to build a successful career or maintain a marriage, you'll literally run out of time. The errors are too costly.
That's a great point. Another pervasive heuristic is social proof, right? The brain's shortcut of deciding that if everyone else in the tribe is doing something, it must be the safest, most correct action.
Exactly. But the heuristic that really stood out in the text, and the one that is perhaps the most universally damaging to our growth, is the familiarity heuristic.
Oh, this one hit hard. This is our brain's deep-seated biological preference for things we already know over things that are novel. It's why we eat the exact same rotation of 5 meals every week.
Or why we walk the exact same route to the train station without even looking around.
Right. It's why we stay in jobs we hate. And it's why we make the exact same mistakes in our romantic relationships over and over again.
The brain clings to the familiar because, from an evolutionary standpoint, the familiar has a track record of keeping you alive. It provides certainty, and the brain craves certainty above almost all else.
It's a survival mechanism that has completely backfired in the modern world. We rely on these familiar patterns, and then we turn around and aggressively complain that our lives feel stagnant or that we're bored.
We constantly demand breakthroughs while our brains violently reject anything that isn't already comfortable.
I like to think of relying on these heuristics for major life decisions as being handed an incredibly powerful but completely untamed search engine.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like you type in a query like, what should I do with my life?
Mhm.
And instead of giving you a curated, rational answer, the search engine instantly vomits up 10,000 terrifying, contradictory results based entirely on what your parents did, what your neighbors are doing, and what felt safest 10 years ago.
That untamed search engine is a perfect way to conceptualize it. And those heuristics are really just the tip of the iceberg. They pave the way for what cognitive scientists call cognitive biases.
Which are basically systemic errors in our thinking, right?
Exactly. They are predictable errors in thinking that completely warp our judgment and our perception of reality. The author notes that scientists have currently identified 106 specific cognitive biases.
Over 100 different ways our own brains are actively, invisibly tricking us every single day. That's exhausting.
It is. Two of the most insidious ones mentioned in the sources are the attentional bias and the confirmation bias. Attentional bias is the biological reality that your perceptions are dictated by dominant thoughts.
How does that work in practice?
Well, there is a system in the brain called the reticular activating system. Its job is to filter out the millions of bits of sensory data you encounter and only show you what it thinks is important.
So if you're focused on a specific car model, suddenly you see it everywhere.
Precisely. But if your default thoughts are cynical, anxious, and negative, your brain will physically filter your reality to highlight evidence that supports that cynicism. You will literally see a darker, more threatening world than someone standing right next to you who has trained a positive attentional bias.
And then you layer confirmation bias on top of that.
Confirmation bias is the brain's tendency to violently protect its existing preconceptions. If you already hold a belief about a political issue, a coworker, or your own capabilities, your brain will work tirelessly to seek out clues and interpret ambiguous information in a way that backs that belief up.
And it just ignores everything else.
It completely ignores, discredits, or simply fails to process any evidence to the contrary. We are not fundamentally wired to look for truth. We are wired to look for evidence that proves we aren't wrong. It protects the ego.
Which leads the author to deliver a really sobering, blunt warning. Don't trust your mind.
It sounds radical, but given the neurobiology we just discussed, it's absolutely necessary. We desperately want to view ourselves as highly rational, objective beings sitting in the driver's seat, making calculated decisions. But it is an illusion.
The text points out that even highly trained scientists, people whose entire professional existence relies on objectivity, fall prey to these biases constantly.
Oh, they're notorious for subtly tweaking experimental parameters or interpreting raw data in ways that magically confirm the hypotheses they spend years developing.
So this leaves us in a really precarious position. If our brains are biologically wired to take lazy shortcuts, and we are plagued by over 100 invisible biases, and we can't even trust our own gut instincts or logic, how do we navigate reality?
How do we figure out what is actually true?
Exactly.
This is the exact point where we have to transition from biology and psychology into philosophy. Historically, the greatest philosophical minds have wrestled with this very dilemma. How do we filter the chaos and determine what is real and actionable?
The sources bring up René Descartes in the 17th century. He was so plagued by this question that he started doubting reality itself. He wondered if he was hallucinating his entire life or being tricked by a demon.
He questioned everything until he finally arrived at his famous baseline, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. His logic was that even if every single thought he had was a crazy illusion, the sheer fact that he was experiencing the illusion meant he must exist as a conscious entity.
It's a brilliant foundational anchor, but as the author rightly points out, it is practically useless for daily life.
Very true. Knowing that you exist on a metaphysical level doesn't help you decide whether to invest in a specific stock or whether you should move across the country for a new job.
Right, and then you have thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who pushed it in a different direction. He famously stated, "There are no facts, only interpretations."
Meaning human beings are trapped entirely within our subjective, biased perception of reality.
Which, based on our discussion of cognitive biases, is neurologically accurate. But again, if there are absolutely no facts, how do I make a decision on a Tuesday afternoon?
Exactly. And this is where the narrative returns to William James and his colleague John Dewey. They look at these abstract philosophical arguments and realized people needed a tool they could actually use.
And that's pragmatism.
Yes. They founded pragmatism, and its core tenet is stunningly direct. True is what works.
True is what works. That shifts the entire paradigm of how we evaluate information. Pragmatism demands that we stop obsessing over abstract first principles or societal cliches and instead look entirely at consequences.
You look at the fruits of an idea, you look at the hard facts of what happens when the idea is put into practice.
I'm trying to picture how to use this as a real-time mental filter, though.
When you are confronted with a piece of information, a sudden anxious thought, or a major life decision, you ask yourself one very sharp question. Will the outcome of holding on to this thought or making this decision fundamentally change the way I live for the better?
And if the answer is no,
If a thought does not serve a tangible, useful purpose, if it does not positively impact your habits, your relationships, or your reality, you must discard it. Under the pragmatic filter, it is untrue for you.
I have to play devil's advocate here because this true is what works. Philosophy seems like it could easily be twisted to justify terrible decisions.
How so?
Well, the author even brings up a friend of his who heard this concept and immediately countered with, well, taking hard drugs works for me. It makes me feel great and relieves my stress. If the only metric is what works, isn't that a massive, dangerous loophole?
It is only a loophole if you apply the philosophy with extreme delusional short-sightedness. The author uses that exact example of the drug user to illustrate that pragmatism must be inextricably grounded in facts, scientific reality, and long-term consequences.
Ah, so it's not just about what works right now.
Precisely. You cannot define what works as whatever provides a momentary dopamine hit. Taking drugs might technically work to numb a person's anxiety on a Friday night, but a pragmatic thinker must look at the entire scope of the consequences.
Like the long-term facts.
Right. The biological realities of addiction, the physiological degradation of the body, the destruction of social ties and career prospects. Those facts prove unequivocally that the action fundamentally destroys the way the person lives. Therefore, under a complete pragmatic filter, the idea that drugs work is entirely false.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. The filter only functions if you are radically honest about the long-term reality.
Exactly. And the author provides a much more relatable, everyday example of applying this filter from his own life, contrasting societal assumptions against pragmatic truth.
Oh, the London story again.
Yes. Society has a very strong, familiar heuristic regarding success. Bigger cities bring bigger opportunities. The universally accepted truth is that if you want to make it, you have to move to a megacity like London, New York, or Tokyo.
And as we discussed in the beginning, he acted on that assumed truth. He orchestrated the massive move to London.
But when he finally got there, and he applied the pragmatic filter to his actual daily lived experience, what did he discover? He was miserable.
Right. He may have had access to broader career networks, but he also acquired massive responsibilities and relentless stress. He hated the densely crowded spaces, the low air quality, the astronomically high cost of living.
Living in a massive metropolis simply did not work for him. That societal truth was having a profoundly negative factual consequence on his life.
So he made a highly pragmatic decision and moved back to his quiet hometown of Leeuwarden.
And immediately his reality improved. He could work fewer hours because his overhead was lower. He paradoxically made more money. He was surrounded by a trusted network of friends, and he could drive anywhere he needed to go in 10 minutes.
His overall quality of life skyrocketed.
Exactly. For his specific existence, the truth was that a small town was vastly superior. Now, a crucial aspect of pragmatism is that he readily acknowledges that for someone else, perhaps someone who thrives on constant networking, his quiet hometown lifestyle would be suffocatingly boring.
It wouldn't work for them.
Right. The beauty of the pragmatic filter is that it forces you to define what is true based exclusively on the specific factual consequences in your unique life, not on generic societal expectations.
So we have this incredibly powerful pragmatic filter. True is what works. But there's a massive practical hurdle here. To even begin applying this filter, we have to find a way to stop the endless, chaotic loop of useless thoughts that are clogging up the machinery.
We have to learn how to essentially stop thinking.
Which sounds like a paradox for a book titled Think Straight, but it leads us directly into the necessity of identifying what is inside versus outside your control.
And the author makes a claim in this section that is initially hard to swallow. He states that fully 99% of our daily thoughts are completely useless preoccupations.
99%. That suggests almost all of our cognitive energy is being wasted.
When you really break down the mental chatter that dominates an average day, it becomes undeniable. Think about the loops. What if this project fails? What did my boss really mean when she looked at me that way? Why does my life look so mundane compared to my friends on Instagram?
What happens if the economy crashes next year? Or does my partner really love me as much as they say they do? Those thoughts feel incredibly urgent and deeply important when you're trapped inside them. They generate real physiological stress.
They absolutely generate a biological stress response. Your heart rate increases, cortisol floods your system. But pragmatically, what do they actually achieve? What tangible problem is solved by sitting on your couch, agonizing over what your boss might be thinking?
Absolutely none. You're just spinning the engine in neutral.
Exactly. The author leans heavily on a classic Stoic rule of thumb here, known as the dichotomy of control. You should only permit yourself to think about things that are within your direct, immediate control. And the hard truth is, The list of things you actually control in this universe is staggeringly short.
According to the sources, it essentially boils down to just four things: your desires, your actions, your words, and your intentions.
That is the entire list. Everything else, the weather, the macroeconomic climate, traffic on your commute, and most importantly, other people's opinions, judgments, actions, is completely outside your sphere of control.
Therefore, any thought dedicated to trying to control or anxiously predict those things is, by definition, useless.
Fantasizing endlessly about some idealized future, useless. Ruminating obsessively on past mistakes, useless.
Although there is a small caveat the author makes about the past, right? He says reflecting on a past mistake is only useful if you're actively extracting a specific actionable lesson so you don't repeat the error.
Yes, extracting a lesson is useful. But just replaying the embarrassment to feel bad about yourself, completely useless. The author distills all useful thought down to just two highly specific categories.
Okay, what are they?
Category 1, thinking about how to solve problems. A problem is simply an unanswered question standing between you and a goal. Applying your cognitive energy to generate an answer to that question is useful.
And category 2.
Understanding knowledge. This means actively taking in new information and internalizing how you can practically apply it to improve your life, your work, or your relationships. Everything else, the other 99% of the noise, you must train yourself to actively ignore.
I have to challenge this slightly, though. What about the persistent voice in your head that constantly tells you to quit?
Ah, the urge to quit.
Yeah, the author is very transparent about this. He says he frequently had thoughts of quitting playing basketball, quitting his jobs, quitting his writing projects. Even when he was engaged in work he truly loved, that profound urge to just walk away would surface out of nowhere. If we are supposed to just filter out and ignore useless thoughts, should we totally ignore our gut instincts? Sometimes the urge to quit is a valid intuition, isn't it?
It's a very nuanced, difficult area to navigate. The author's approach is not to violently suppress the thought or pretend it doesn't exist. Remember our earlier point about the river of consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
You cannot control the fact that the thought of quitting will bubble up to the surface.
Right, you can only control your focus.
Exactly. The mastery lies entirely onto it. His method is to acknowledge the thought's presence without identifying with it and without blaming himself for having it. When the urge to quit arises, he mentally steps back and says to the thought, "You do not control me."
It's a deliberate separation of his core identity from the passing thought.
Precisely. Now, he acknowledges that in some rare instances, that persistent urge to quit is a genuine pragmatic signal that a situation is toxic or is fundamentally broken. But far more often, it is simply the brain's lazy heuristic fear.
It's the brain trying to escape the discomfort of hard work or uncertainty.
The pragmatic approach is to pause and evaluate the thought objectively. Is this a legitimate problem I need to solve? Or is this just fear attempting to hijack my actions? You refuse to surrender to the feeling blindly.
Which means that taking control of your mind doesn't mean figuring out how to think or rushing brilliant snap solutions. In fact, clarity often requires the exact opposite approach. It requires slowing down your processing drastically.
And this exposes a massive cultural blind spot, the myth of the fast thinker.
We culturally idolize the fast thinker. We revere the person who is always quick on their feet, the CEO who makes aggressive snap decisions, the politician with an instant witty comeback. We equate speed with intelligence.
But as the author points out, fast thinking is very often incredibly poor thinking.
The sources reference Derek Sivers heavily here, who's a fantastic thinker and entrepreneur. Sivers argues convincingly that your absolute first reaction to any problem or question is almost always your worst reaction.
It's usually just an outdated script you memorized years ago that you are regurgitating to save time. Or worse, it's a knee-jerk emotional response triggered by some unresolved past trauma or bias. It is rarely a considered pragmatic thought.
Sivers provides a brilliant extreme case study for his own life regarding the dangers of fast thinking. Over an 8-year period running his company, he personally answered 192,000 emails from his readers and customers.
Just try to fathom the cognitive load of that number, 192,000 separate inquiries.
It was entirely consuming his existence. So inevitably, he hit a breaking point of profound burnout. And his very first thought, his fast, knee-jerk emotional reaction, was to go completely off the grid. He wanted to pull a full Henry David Thoreau.
Shut off all email servers, delete all social media, and make himself entirely unreachable.
And honestly, when you're that overwhelmed, that fast thought sounds incredibly romantic and deeply tempting. just burn the whole system down and run away to the woods.
It's a highly emotional, extreme binary reaction. But Sivers is a meticulously trained, slow thinker. He recognized the fast thought for what it was, and he didn't act on it. He let the urge sit.
He gave his brain the time required to actually process the variables.
And eventually, a much slower, exponentially better second thought arrived. He realized he didn't need to vanish from the earth. He could remain completely reachable and public. He simply needed to stop answering the questions.
That is a profound, subtle shift. It pragmatically solves the actual problem, the massive time drain of typing out answers, without triggering the dramatic, unnecessary consequence of isolating himself from his audience.
And that is the true power of slow thinking. The author applies this concept to everyday life, too, particularly regarding the danger of making quick yes decisions for events far in the future.
Oh, this scenario is so painfully relatable. It's Mart, and a colleague asks, "Hey, do you want to fly out to Thailand for a massive business conference in September?"
And your fast-thinking brain, heavily influenced by the social proof heuristic of wanting to seem eager, goes, September, that's 6 months away. Sure, I'd love to.
You commit instantly without engaging your analytical mind. But then September actually rolls around. You're finally in a great rhythm at home. You have big local projects moving forward. You're exercising every day. And suddenly, this massive, disruptive international trip is looming over you, threatening to wreck your entire routine.
And you spend 3 weeks agonizing, should I cancel? Can I get out of it? Should I just for 2 days?
You manufacture all of this intense mental anguish simply because you refuse to take an extra 24 hours back in March to actually slow down and think the commitment through.
We manufacture our own chaos by refusing to utilize the phrase, let me think about it and get back to you. And part of the reason we rush these decisions is that true, deep, slow thinking is physically and mentally uncomfortable.
When you truly start pushing your brain to learn new concepts and forge new pathways, you will eventually hit what the author describes as a mental wall.
He describes his own experience with this very vividly. When he first decided to aggressively train his mind, committing to reading dense material for 2 hours a day, taking extensive notes, writing long-form articles, he felt incredibly sharp for the first few weeks.
But eventually he suffered a complete cognitive breakdown. His mind just froze. He literally couldn't read a page, he couldn't write a sentence, and he had a physical tension headache that lasted all day long. It lasted for an entire week.
He was experiencing the cognitive equivalent of muscle failure.
Exactly. And when he finally recovered and pushed his training again, he hit another wall later. When you're in it, hitting that wall feels like utter failure. It feels like you've reached the absolute biological limit of your intelligence, and you should just quit trying to improve.
But the crucial reframing required here is understanding the biological reality of what that wall actually represents. The brain isn't just an empty bucket you pour facts into. It is a vast, dense, physical network of billions of neurons.
Right.
Every time you learn something genuinely new, your brain is working incredibly hard to scan that new data, compare it to existing memories, and physically forge new neural connections through a process called neuroplasticity. This requires massive amounts of energy.
It reminds me of the concept Steve Jobs famously talked about in his Stanford commencement address.
Yeah.
You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. You have to trust that the diverse, seemingly unrelated pieces of information you are struggling to learn right now will eventually form a cohesive picture in the future.
That's exactly what is happening neurologically. You are feeding the network with raw material, and when you hit that mental wall, when you get the severe headache and the dense brain fog, it is not a signal that you are broken or stupid.
It's a biological signal that your neural network is currently at maximum capacity processing all those new dots.
You are standing on the very threshold of the next stage of learning, and the brain needs time to consolidate the pathways.
So what is the pragmatic solution when you hit that wall? It's definitely not to push harder and force it. The author insists you have to step away and let the brain recover.
During these periods, he deliberately hangs out with friends. He plays table tennis. He listens to artists like Jay-Z, Kendrick Lamar, or Bon Iver.
He intentionally engages in activities that require zero active analytical thought. He allows his subconscious mind to do the heavy background lifting of connecting those dots, and when he finally returns to the work, he breaks right through the previous wall.
It is exactly like taking a required rest day after a heavy weightlifting session. The actual muscle growth happens during the rest, not during the lifting. But there's another fascinating layer to this. Sometimes even thinking slower and taking adequate rest isn't enough to break us out of our entrenched patterns.
Sometimes we have to change the entire modality of how we process information. We have to take words out of the equation entirely.
I found this section on visual thinking to be one of the most illuminating parts of the book because we are all so heavily biased toward language.
We really are. We think in words, we talk to ourselves constantly in an inner monologue of words, we take notes in words. But in the grand scheme of human evolution, complex language is a very recent invention. For the vast majority of our history, we thought entirely in images and spatial relationships.
And some of the most profound revolutionary minds in history deliberately cultivated this visual thinking. The sources point specifically to Leonardo da Vinci.
If you look at Da Vinci's surviving notebooks, they aren't just dense blocks of linear text. They are overflowing with detailed sketches, anatomical diagrams, geometrical shapes. He understood that language is a bottleneck.
Language is linear. You have to process one word after another. But a drawing allows you to see the relationship between multiple variables simultaneously.
The author adopted this practice himself. He found that trying to think through a complex problem purely in words kept him trapped inside that chaotic, noisy scribble. The constant inner monologue just generates more anxiety. So he started physically drawing his thoughts.
Even if it's just crude stick figures, basic graphs, or flowcharts.
The very physical act of translating an abstract, swirling thought into a tangible image on paper frees the mind from constant verbalization. It forces a completely different type of structural clarity.
In fact, the core conceptual image of this entire book, the chaotic scribble turning into the straight arrow, started simply as a random drawing he made in his notebook to try and visualize his own mental state.
Visualizing forces you out of conventional, language-based frameworks. And one of the most toxic, limiting conventional frameworks we rely on is binary thinking.
This is the ingrained belief that every complex decision is a simple either proposition. And the primary tool we use to reinforce binary thinking is the classic pros and cons list.
Oh, the pros and cons list. Invented by Benjamin Franklin way back in 1772. We all use it. You draw a line down the middle of the paper, list the pros on the left, the cons on the right. It feels so incredibly rational and scientific.
But psychologically and mathematically, it is deeply flawed.
The author provides a hilarious and honestly slightly embarrassing example of this from his own life. He admits that when his very first serious relationship hit a rough patch, a well-meaning friend told him to make a pros and cons list to decide whether he should break up with his girlfriend.
Which is such an absurdly clinical, robotic way to approach complex human emotion.
It really is. But look at the actual list he generated. Pros of staying together, someone to share things with, sex, going on holidays together, cons of staying, less free time for myself, getting into fights, having to visit the in-laws.
It's completely generic. That list effectively describes almost every single relationship in human history. It offers zero specific insight.
Exactly. And more importantly, it's useless because a pros and cons list inherently assumes that every single item on the list carries equal weight. But in reality, one single factor usually outweighs everything else combined.
If the core con is that you fundamentally do not trust the person, it doesn't matter if there are 20 pros about them being a great cook or really fun on vacation. The lack of trust breaks the system.
The list gives you a false sense of mathematical certainty while ignoring the actual weight of the variables.
It traps you inside a very narrow artificial box. The author uses another excellent visual analogy here. If you are standing inside a maze, conventional ground-level thinking dictates that you must navigate the corridors, take lefts and rights, and try to reach the prize in the middle.
Right, you're focused entirely on the immediate walls surrounding you. You're just looking at the next corner, trying not to hit a dead end.
But what if you step completely out of the maze? What if you elevate and take a helicopter view? If you look at the entire maze from above, you might realize that the prize you are looking for isn't in the middle of the maze at all. The prize might be completely outside the box entirely.
But you could never possibly see that as long as you were trapped in the conventional binary way of thinking.
This helicopter view is what actually breaks the binary either trap. The author gives a fantastic career example of this. People constantly assume they must either have a safe, predictable corporate job, or they must take a massive, terrifying risk and start their own business.
It's a binary choice. But when his own business was struggling to grow and he was running out of money, he took the helicopter view. He didn't quit his business and admit defeat, and he didn't stubbornly starve to death either.
He stepped outside the maze and simply took a job at a large IT research firm. He ran his business on the nights and weekends and worked the corporate job during the day. He did both. He broke the binary by finding an unconventional hybrid solution.
But to recognize those unconventional solutions and to know what kind of life you actually want to build outside the maze requires a deep, unflinching understanding of your own specific traits. You have to know who you are. This brings us to the absolute necessity of self-knowledge.
He refers to this as knowing your DNA. And to be clear, we don't mean your biological genetics here. We mean your core values, your authentic likes, and your non-negotiable dislikes.
It sounds like such obvious advice, but it is genuinely stunning how little time most of us spend figuring out who we actually are, as opposed to blindly accepting who society tells us we should be.
The author shares a story about a different relationship that highlights this exact tension perfectly. He was dating a girl who had a very common, culturally celebrated goal. She wanted to travel the world constantly and live as an expat in different countries.
Which, thanks to social media and travel influencers, is heavily marketed as the ultimate, idealized dream for young people.
Exactly. It's the conventional ideal of a successful life. But the author, taking a hard, honest look at his own DNA, realized he absolutely hated that idea. He genuinely loves his small hometown. He wants to stay close to his family and his core group of best friends.
He deeply enjoys routine and stability. He doesn't feel an ounce of FOMO fear of missing out about not living in a villa in Bali or an apartment in Berlin. Having a stable, predictable home base is what practically generates his happiness.
And this is where rigorous self-knowledge becomes crucial. When two people have fundamentally conflicting baseline values like that, it's a zero-sum game. If they stay together, one person is always going to be sacrificing a core pillar of their identity to appease the other.
So, applying the pragmatic filter, they broke up. It wasn't about one person being right and the other being wrong. It was simply a factual mismatch of foundational DNA.
And self-knowledge isn't just about making big, sweeping lifestyle choices. It's about intimately understanding your own daily flaws and operational weaknesses. The author shares a story that honestly makes my stomach drop just reading it. The $150,000 email mistake.
Oh, it is a brutal, painful lesson in the psychology of cognitive offloading and the absolute necessity of details. So he is in the middle of negotiating a massive, multi-year consulting deal with two entirely different companies at the exact same time.
And by sheer unfortunate coincidence, both of his main contacts at these two companies have the exact same first name. Let's call them Wim.
Wim A is an existing, highly loyal client who's been with him for years. Wim B is a brand new prospect he's trying to land. Because Wim A is a loyal legacy client, the author offers a highly discounted, preferential rate for the new project.
You can see the disaster forming from a mile away.
You really can. So he goes to his computer to email the heavily discounted contract to Wim A. But the author openly admits flaw here. He is deeply, habitually lazy when it comes to the mundane task of sending emails.
He relies on cognitive offloading. He just types the first letter of the name, lets the email client's autofill do the rest, and hits send without double-checking the actual address.
So in a split second, he accidentally emails the highly confidential, heavily discounted contract intended for Wim A directly to Wim B.
And Wim B had already been sent the initial, much higher standard proposal for his company.
Exactly. So Wim B opens this new contract, sees this incredibly low rate being offered to another guy, and is absolutely furious. He replies asking, "Why does this other guy get a massively lower rate? Is this how you do business?" And Wim B walks away from the deal entirely. Over $150,000 lost in an instant because of a split-second, lazy heuristic habit.
Now, the conventional emotional reaction here would be to wallow in self-pity and repeatedly ask, why am I so lazy? Why did I do that? What is wrong with me?
But the pragmatic rule the author emphasizes here is vital. Do not ask why you made a mistake. Just fix it. Asking why is very often just a clever excuse to psychoanalyze yourself and play the victim instead of taking immediate responsibility.
The harsh reality is he was lazy, he relied on an automated system he shouldn't have, and details matter. Small errors in thinking become massive real-world problems.
So if our minds are this chaotic, and we are inherently prone to these devastating lazy mistakes, how do we actually protect ourselves on a daily basis? The answer he provides is somewhat counterintuitive, especially for a book entirely about thinking.
The ultimate goal is to take thinking out of the equation as much as humanly possible. You achieve this by creating rigid systems. The formula is action must be greater than thinking.
A system is essentially a set of predetermined, rigid rules that govern your behavior. You build them specifically so you don't have to waste precious cognitive energy making a choice in the heat of the moment when your heuristics and biases are most likely to hijack you.
He uses physical fitness as the prime example of this. For years, he struggled with his weight and his health because every single day he engaged in a draining mental debate. Should I go to the gym today or should I wait until tomorrow? Should I run or should I lift weights? Should I eat this bag of chips or make a salad?
That is exhausting, useless thinking. And usually, the laziness heuristic wins that debate, and you end up staying on the couch.
So he completely eliminated the debate by replacing it with a system.
A very simple, non-negotiable system. Rule 1. Exercise at least 30 minutes every single day, no exceptions. Rule 2. Don't go all out and burn yourself out, keep it sustainable. Rule 3. Eat healthy, whole foods, no junk food. Rule 4. Calories consumed must be less than calories burned. Rule 5. Track every single metric.
Once those 5 rules are locked in place, the daily debate is entirely over. You don't have to wake up and ask, should I go to the gym today? The system dictates that you do. The decision was already made weeks ago.
And he applied the same meticulous systemic thinking to the creation of the book itself. The sources note it took him 15 grueling months to write Think Straight. He spent countless hours researching, writing, cutting, and rewriting. But look specifically at how he systemized the title selection process to avoid bias,
This is a great detail. His very first working title was The Art of Practicality.
which on the surface sounds like a decent conventional self-help book title.
Right, but he applies his own pragmatic filter to it. What does the art of even mean in this context? It's vague, it's flowery, it doesn't serve a sharp, useful purpose, so he scraps it entirely. His second attempt is The Power of Pragmatic Thinking.
Again, it sounds very authoritative and academic.
But then he looks at the actual data. He goes to Goodreads and searches the exact phrase, the power of. He finds 83,895 books that start with that exact phrase.
If his goal is to stand out and offer a uniquely unconventional approach to thinking, relying on a cliche that 80,000 other authors have already used is a massive failure of details. So he keeps working, keeps filtering, until he finally lands on the sharp, imperative, unmistakable command, think straight.
I think it's important to address a potential contradiction here, though.
No.
Yeah, on one hand, he's advocating for being incredibly meticulous, analytical, and detail-oriented, like obsessing over the exact phrasing of a title based on database searches. But on the other hand, he is telling us to build systems specifically so we can stop thinking and operate on autopilot. How do those two concepts coexist without clashing?
That's exactly what I was wondering. Are we supposed to be hyper-analytical about everything, or are we supposed to just blindly follow the rules we set up?
It's a matter of sequence. It's not a contradiction. It's a two-step process. You deploy deep, meticulous, highly analytical thinking initially to establish your core values and build the architecture of your system. You think incredibly hard once, so you don't have to think weakly 1,000 times later.
Ah, okay, so the cognitive effort is heavily front-loaded.
Exactly. Take his financial system, which he calls his 5 money rules. Rule 1, don't buy stuff you don't need. Rule 2, save at least 10% of your income. Rule 3, stay out of consumer debt. Rule 4, invest in assets with a return. Rule 5, don't be stingy because it's just money.
He thought deeply and analyzed his past financial mistakes to create those rules based on his values. Now that the system is built, he doesn't agonize over daily purchases. He doesn't lay in bed at night sweating about his bank account. The system completely automates his financial behavior.
He only engages his deep analytical thinking again if the system stops producing the desired results.
That is the ultimate form of cognitive offloading. Knowing yourself and building these rigid systems frees up massive amounts of mental energy that used to be wasted on the chaotic scribble. And that leads us to the final, most important question. What do you actually do with all that freed up mental energy?
What is the ultimate overarching goal of training your mind to think straight?
When you finally clear away the noise, the heuristics, and the useless ruminations, you are forced to confront the present moment and the actual trajectory of your life. And one of the most powerful, sobering motivators the author shares regarding this is the story of his own grandmother.
This part of the text is deeply moving. His grandmother moved to the Netherlands from Iran later in her life, and the author observes that in her final years, she spent almost every single day crying.
But she wasn't crying because of things she had done wrong or mistakes she had made. She was crying out of profound regret for the things she didn't do. She had made massive sacrifices for her family, and the unlived portions of her life, the risks she never took, haunted her endlessly.
It reinforces a classic psychological truth. At the end of the road, human beings rarely regret their failures. We regret our hesitations. We regret the bold actions we didn't take because we were paralyzed by the chaotic scribble of useless, fearful thoughts.
And the author internalized this lesson deeply. He adopted a strict policy of rapid action and zero regret, even when it means failing publicly. He talks openly about launching a paid membership site for his readers. He did all the math based on conventional wisdom. If he could just get 1,000 true fans paying $5 a month, he'd have a stable, independent income.
He spent 3 grueling months building the site infrastructure, writing the sales copy, and creating exclusive content.
What was the market response?
Complete crickets. After a full month of heavy promotion, he had exactly 78 signups. People were actively canceling. The pressure to create high-level exclusive content for such a tiny group was draining all his time and energy away from his main business and his broader writing.
So what did he do? After just 6 weeks of operation, he pulled the plug entirely. He shut the whole thing down.
Now, many of his friends and entrepreneurial colleagues told him he was quitting way too early. The conventional advice was to push through the dip.
But the author applied the pragmatic filter. The facts were undeniably clear. The math simply wasn't working, and the opportunity cost of his time was far too high. It was a failure. But, and this is the critical part, he didn't beat himself up.
He didn't ruminate. He looked back at the failure for exactly 5 minutes, solely to extract the pragmatic lesson. I can only take on one major project per aspect of my life. Once he had that lesson secured, he never looked back again. He moved immediately forward.
Because staring at the past is a tragic waste of the present. The ultimate prize of this entire process of recognizing your biases, filtering your thoughts, ignoring the useless noise, building systems, and taking rapid action is inner calm. And he stresses heavily that inner calm isn't something you can purchase.
Right, you don't need a $100 sustainably sourced yoga mat. You don't need a $10,000 silent meditation retreat in Bali. You don't need to burn specific incense.
Inner calm is simply the mastery of your own mind. It is the ability to sit absolutely anywhere, on a noisy bus, at a stressful desk, in a crowded room, observe the chaotic thoughts bubbling up from the river of your consciousness, and consciously, deliberately decide to ignore them.
It is the quiet, profound power of saying, I control my focus. I decide what this machine does.
And once you achieve that baseline of calm, once you aren't constantly drowning in your own mental chaos, you finally have the bandwidth to look outward. You can start thinking beyond your own immediate survival. And the source is closed with this incredible historical anecdote that ties everything beautifully back to the very beginning of our deep dive.
We started with William James and Charles Sanders Peirce, the 2 original founders of pragmatism.
Yes, they met as young men at Harvard in the 1860s. Peirce was considered an absolute generational prodigy, a true genius of mathematics, logic, and philosophy. James, as we discussed, was struggling with deep depression and panic attacks before finding his footing.
But their lives took wildly, tragically different trajectories. James wrote The Principles of Psychology in 1890, became a famous Harvard professor, a celebrated author, and an academic superstar. His life went steadily up and up.
Peirce, on the other hand, lost absolutely everything. He was fired from Johns Hopkins University in 1884 due to a messy scandal involving his remarriage. And because of the rigid morals of the time, he never recovered. He couldn't find academic work anywhere again. He fell into abject poverty.
The former prodigy ended up literally homeless, sleeping on the cold streets of New York City, completely and utterly forgotten by the academic world he helped build.
Forgotten by everyone except by William James.
Right. In 1898, William James is at the absolute height of his global fame. He is invited to give a massively important lecture called Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results, where he formally introduces the philosophy of pragmatism to the wider world.
And in that highly public lecture, James deliberately and forcefully credits the entire foundation of pragmatism to the forgotten, destitute Charles Sanders Peirce.
The magnitude of that gesture cannot be overstated. James did not have to do that. He easily could have taken all the credit for himself. Pragmatism was his vehicle, he popularized it, he wrote the defining texts. But he recognized that an idea's practical value extends to how it affects others.
By publicly crediting Peirce on that massive stage, James single-handedly resurrected his friend's shattered reputation. It allowed Peirce to gain enough respect to publish several more important papers in his final years and secure a small income.
It is such a beautiful, tangible application of the philosophy itself. James used his meticulously trained, highly functioning mind not just to cure his own depression and not just to build his own prestigious career, but to reach down and pull someone else out of the dark.
Which perfectly encapsulates a quote from William James that the author uses to essentially close his entire thesis. The greatest use of a life is to spend it on something that will outlast it. If you train your mind to cut through the daily chaos, you finally have the energy and the clarity to create things, build systems, and help people in ways that will reverberate long after you are gone.
So, we've covered incredible ground today. We started in that panic-filled hotel room in London, surrounded by the chaotic scribble of a mind out of control. We traveled back to 1869 to realize the biological and philosophical truth that we do possess the free will to choose our focus.
We unpack the terrifying reality that our default brains are lazy, riddled with cognitive biases, reliant on outdated heuristics, and fundamentally untrustworthy. We learn to apply the pragmatic filter, asking simply, does the consequence of this thought actually improve my reality?
We discovered the immense power of ignoring the 99% of things outside our control, the absolute necessity of slowing down to break through cognitive walls, and the value of stepping outside the maze of binary thinking.
We saw how understanding our own specific DNA allows us to build rigid systems that automate our actions, completely removing the exhaustion of daily decision-making. And ultimately, we saw that all of this rigorous mental training isn't just a selfish pursuit of personal productivity. It's about achieving the inner calm required to leave a legacy that outlasts us, just as William James did for his friend.
It is a profound, demanding manual for operating the human machine. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on a quote from William James's godfather, the essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson profoundly stated, "You become what you think about all day long."
So I ask you to consider this. If your life is a literal physical printout of the exact thoughts you are choosing to sustain every single day, what specific future are you printing right at this very second? And more importantly, when you look at that printout, is it a future you actually want to live in?
Wow. That is the perfect question to leave hanging in the air. We've gone from the muddy, chaotic waters of a panicked mind to a crystal clear mirror reflecting exactly who we are choosing to become.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Think Straight. And before we go, one final reminder. If you found value in this conversation, please support the channel that made it possible. Head over to Book Visionary, hit that subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment down below about what future you are printing, and ring the bell icon so you never miss out. We'll see you on the next deep dive.